Benjamin, professor of economics here at the U of T. He's a former chair of his department, then he was vice dean of graduate education at the Faculty of Arts and Science, and he's now, for at least another month, Provostial advisor on recruitment, enrollment, and educational space and technology. And I said about a month because in July he'll begin yet another new appointment as the Vice Provost, Strategic Enrollment Management. And I want to ask you more about that later, but anyway, he's perfectly positioned, I think, for this new role as he has been for all the others. He's a labor economist who was the managing editor of the Canadian Journal of Economics from 2005 to 2008. His research into the labor market in both Canada and in developing countries has evolved over the years to include the broader economics of post-secondary education. And he's in a way been able to take his scholarly work into the field and at all levels. In his department, he was able to identify determinants of success in undergraduate students. In arts and science, he oversaw matters relating to graduate enrollment planning, administration of funds to support graduate activities, graduate program development, and governance matters. But I suspect it was mostly because of his research on estimating economic returns of graduate student education in North America that he was invited to be part of the prestigious Canadian Council of Academies expert panel on the labor market transition of PhD graduates. And that's what he's here to talk about today. His topic is labor market outcomes of PhD graduates in Canada, a closer look at the CCA's report called Degrees of Success. Please welcome Dwayne Benjamin. I'll have to get you to unmute yourself, Dwayne.
I was re-muted. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm going to move to my slides here, and I never know what happens after I click share screen. So just let me know if there's an issue here, because I also have to put it to full screen. Is that all doing what it's supposed to do?
It is indeed.
Excellent, thank you. And can you see the cursor? I never know if the cursor is visible.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. So the only thing I'm going to correct on the introduction was that it wasn't my expertise on PhD labor market outcomes that had me invited to be on the CCA panel. It was the other way around. That once I was on the panel, I figured I better exploit this opportunity to try to learn something about the economic returns to a PhD. The sort of broad narrative when I was invited to do this presentation about my research, I thought, well, most of my research now is about how I can fit things into my calendar. I took great pride in knowing all the latest statistical software and Fortran compilers and so on over the years, and then eventually it just, how many ways can I count the emails in my inbox is really the latest software. But then I realized, no, actually I have been engaged in some research, and it's really been what I would call field research based on the jobs I now have. And so when I was graduate dean or graduate vice dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science, I had an opportunity to step outside my own discipline and to learn a lot about other disciplines and how they worked, and discovered that not everything's like economics. The PhD programs are quite different across the Faculty of Arts and Science, and completely different structures, different cultures. It was really eye-opening to see that. And then when I was asked to serve on this expert panel, first of all, it was a real honor, as I'll show you the other members of the panel later. But it was also a chance to work in an interdisciplinary setting, not just talking about different disciplines in terms of working with them in terms of their programs, but rather really thinking through the question of labor market outcomes of PhD students and how it connects to everything through an interdisciplinary lens. So I'm going to focus more on the economics angles of what's in the report, but really there's a lot more to that. So I have to click this part here. There we go. Just to give you an outline of what I'll do. I'll give you a kind of a crash version of the CCA report itself. It's a long report, but it just gives you a sense of what was in it. It's not, and I think that what you would see if you read the executive summary or looked at it at all, there's nothing really new in there in terms of the kind of thoughts you may have had about graduate education before. It's really just the way that it's packaged, and it's obviously relatively up to date. So I'll talk a bit about that. And then what I'll do is talk a little bit about the Chapter 5 part, which is really that focuses in on labor market outcomes of PhD students in Canada, PhD graduates in Canada, and really just show you how we get some of the results that we try to highlight a little bit. And then I'll talk about some new research that's coming out of this. Is really just in its total infancy that I'm working on with a graduate student of my own, Boriana Milicheva, that we're trying to see some of the sort of hypotheses, some of the puzzles that emerge, or not really puzzles, but hypotheses that emerge out of this study that we can really investigate, looking at Canada-US comparisons. So just to kind of let you know a little bit how the CCA works. So that's the Canadian Council of Academies, is the sort of umbrella academy of the Royal Society, and the relevant ones for engineers and medicine. Don't remember all their names. The CCA works with, they do pro bono. I mean, they get some money to finance it, but the rest of us that are involved work for free. So it's not really a consulting project, but it's like a consulting project. The federal government or the government will usually give them a budget to dive into some particular question. And so they have some responsibility when they're doing the report then to answer the question they've been asked to answer. So they're not really just curiosity driven. So the charge that they were given from ISED, which is the Industry, Science, and Economic Development Ministry, they are the home federal ministry for SSHRC and NSERC and CIHR and other parts of the funding agencies for education in Canada, post-secondary education. They really wanted us to focus in on what are the main challenges that PhD students in Canada face in transitioning to the labor market, and how do these differ by fields of study. You know, that was the question they wanted, and you'll see if you look in the report that we don't necessarily answer all these questions equally. The sub-questions included what unique challenges do PhD graduates working in Canada face in launching their careers within academia? What unique challenges do PhD graduates working in Canada face? Well, that's just cut and paste duplication. What are the key motivations behind the migration of PhD graduates in and out of Canada? So there's a global dimension to this. Is brain circulation, which is what their words are, simply a feature of a highly globalized economy? Or is it caused by a lack of opportunities? So those are the kind of questions they want to know. Really, is there anything special about PhD student? Oh yeah, that's second bullet point's not a cut and paste. It's inside and outside academia. And we do try to address that a little bit. This is just a slide summarizes who the expert panel was. It was chaired by Elizabeth Cannon, who is the former president of the University of Calgary. She's incredible, an engineer. And as I said, it was a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary panel, including my colleague from the University of Toronto, Reinhard Reichmeyer, who is from the Faculty of Medicine. And he was the sort of main mover and shaker behind the 10,000 PhD project at the University of Toronto. So he certainly had a history of looking at these kinds of questions. But the nice thing about the panel, in addition to being interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, it also had different vintages. It had some recent PhD students as well as faculty from different disciplines. The report, once of course we have the charge from ISED, then we get to write what we want. And it was one of those experiences, certainly beyond working with people from a variety of different disciplines. It was kind of nice to have almost no work to do except show up and talk about, in some structured way, talk about all these really interesting questions about what it is, about what we do in educating and our scholars as PhD students and helping them get jobs, and what is going on out in the job market that we need to take into account even as we design our programs. So the report, and again, I'm just going to go through this really quickly. We talk a little bit about the institutional funding context, simply to know what's really happening. What's the economic environment like? What's the educational environment like that this is all operating in? We wanted to know a little bit about. The focus wasn't going to be about the PhD student experience itself. There's lots of cool questions on time to completion and choosing dissertations and supervisor relationships. There's tons of really fascinating work about PhD students, but that really wasn't the focus of the report. But it does touch on questions of how students fare in the labor market and what our roles are as supervisors. The subsequent chapters really get thinking as an economist, really the supply and demand side. So there's a little bit on the supply side here about where the PhD students are coming from, but also then really looking at in chapter 4 about employer capacity to hire PhD. So that would be the academic sector, but also the non-academic sector as well. And one of the things that you'll see as I go through the talk, and there's a lot of things that get lost in telling a story about the PhD student experience, of course, is that it varies by discipline. We'll show a little bit about that. And so somebody in the humanities is going to have a very different experience as a graduate student and in the labor market than somebody in finance or somebody in chemistry or computer science or whatever, right? We know this all varies. So I'm going to gloss a bit of that over. But that said, connections to the labor market and labor market opportunities are also going to vary. Chapter 5, which I said I'm going to talk a bit more detail, it's kind of the meat. This is like the bottom line. What are the outcomes of PhD students in Canada? How has that changed over time? Chapter 6 really looks at international mobility. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but it's not to diminish the importance of the topic. It's just that, yes, PhD students come and go. It's an international market. It's not the case that we could think of Canada as just being its own isolated labor market. Chapter 7 then talks about, and of course, it's a bit of a buffet of discussion on different programs and approaches that have been embarked on at different universities to try to help PhD students in their adjustments and adaptation to the labor market and get jobs and so on. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but of course, we've got lots of time for discussion and well beyond anything I had to do with this report, as a vice dean, graduate, and all of you in your careers, there's lots of programs and approaches we know work or don't work or have thoughts on that work or don't work in terms of helping PhD students succeed. And finally, there's a conclusion, which again, I'm going to get to. So what were the key findings? Well, the key findings are perhaps not surprising. So, but this is where we start, and a couple of things to other background. One of there were some rails we were kept on. So the first rail is we didn't want to get into the question, are there too many or too few PhD students? That's not a well-posed question anyway. People can have opinions about whether there's too many or too few. We could ask whether there's incentives that are right or wrong for students to pursue PhDs. There's lots of questions we can ask in that regard, but we didn't want to get into issues of whether there's too many or too few. The second set of rails is the CCA, as a matter of policy, does not make recommendations. So they'd never make recommendations to the sponsors. It's really just lay it all out. So there's nothing in there that suggests this is what we think we should do. So what are the findings? So the findings are, first of all, the number of PhD students in Canada is growing, while the number of open tenure track positions is stagnant or declining. And that's just, it's this a couple of graphs I'll show you that really tell everything else. It just sets it right up. There's more PhD students being graduated than there are jobs available in Canada. Now, that wouldn't be such a big problem, except that the non-academic sector in Canada has not significantly increased its uptake of PhD graduates either. And so, and we'll see that at the end is in contrast to a lot of other countries. And so when you have big supply and no increase in demand, it's not a big surprise then that the labor market outcomes for PhD students have been declining. And that's what we basically show. It does differ by gender, so that there's quite a different story for men than women, males than females. And I'll talk about that. It's also quite interesting to gender dimension here. And the economic return to a PhD, which I'll define more precisely later, has declined over time and is lower for the younger graduates to the point where you kind of wonder, is it really a good idea at the margin, not on average, but for all the students pursuing PhDs to really be pursuing them. These other findings, which are ones I'll talk less about, but happy to discuss when we get to that point in the discussion part of the session, is the academic culture can support or hinder the transition of PhDs to the labor market. That's not a big surprise. What does it mean? really is the question, is it the case that we have, and I think this is an oversimplification, but is it the case that we have this apprenticeship model in our PhD programs where we are essentially imagining all our PhD students are becoming future professors, and that that's a bit delusional, and that we're deluding ourselves and them, and that that's just not true. And we've designed our programs only to support students, and primarily to support students who are going to pursue the same career paths that we're on, and that if we're not supportive, like, is there something about our culture that's really hurting students in some sense when they get to the labor market, and that turns out not to be possible. Another finding is that PhD students themselves may not be market savvy. They may not kind of realize that they've actually, over their 5, 6, 7 years or whatever of PhD studies, that they've actually developed some really incredibly useful skills and abilities that they could bring to future employers, but they don't really know. And employers may think, well, there's a student who's PhD in classics. What value is that to my organization? And in fact, they can be incredibly valuable. So is there a mismatch of sort of the skills that are perceived and the skills that are actually had? And then, of course, the final conclusion is really just, again, the story that we tell for Canada really is just a part of the story, that students leave Canada for other countries. There's jobs elsewhere if you can't get one here. And similarly, you can be studying your PhD here in Canada, and you're going to be competing with PhD students from Harvard and everywhere else for the jobs here too. So it's an international market. So that's the key findings. So what I want to do is really just kind of give you a little bit of a sense, a little bit more detail on some of the context, and also a discussion of how we got the results that we did. Just a little bit more meat to this. So the first graph here is that I'm showing, there's obviously more graphs in the report, is just the rising supply of PhD graduates. And so you can see that, this is the number of PhDs awarded per 10,000 people. And so you can see that, in 2002, you're looking at whatever, 1.75, which by 2017 is almost doubled. So we're almost doubling the number of PhD students per capita over that time period. And if you think, for example, in the province of Ontario, back in the early 2000s, we had graduate expansion where the province consciously wanted to basically add 3,500 or something like that PhD spaces, graduate spaces in the province, with a sense there's a strong belief that if we graduate more PhD students, we will build the level of human capital in the economy, and that jobs will come. We'll just improve the level of innovation and so on in the economy. So there's a sense of just keep educating, and it will take care of itself. So a certain element of that. Obviously, there's lots of funding at the federal level as well. There's increasing, funds for INSHRC and support for graduate students directly, also for faculty research grants. So there's a lot of reasons why you can see PhDs increasing over time. Also, undergraduate enrollment's been rising significantly, and especially with international undergraduate enrollment at the University of Toronto and elsewhere. That provides more resources to universities to be able to fund more PhD students, to help professors in research and so on. So there's all kinds of factors at play here that have led to this increased number of PhD students. Now, in terms of the academic job market, though, you can see here, this is a graph, again, from 2000, basically to the present, of not the vacancies or job openings, but just the number of people employed in these different levels. So if you look at the number of assistant professors, those are going to be the young professors. And you can see that there's a little bit of a peak in around 2006 or so. And then the number of assistant professors is gently declining. And so that's just a suggestion, pretty clear, that there's not a lot of new jobs there for PhD students. At the same time, you can see that the full professors, the blue line or whatever it is gently rising. And the associate professor ranks are kind of rising and then tailing off a little bit. Essentially, what's happening is, and you can see this at the University of Toronto, and I'm sure almost every other university, the faculty are aging. There's end of mandatory retirement, and people are hanging around longer, and there's just fewer and fewer positions available for new faculty. So that's what's really fundamentally happening. There's still gentle increase in the number of total professors, but really nowhere near in proportion to the increases in enrollments that we see at the undergraduate level. So this is really, you think in light of the previous graph of the increasing number of PhD students, if the PhD students see these graphs, they should get a pretty good sense that unless there's a sudden increase in retirements, you're not going to see a lot of academic openings in Canada. And that's borne out by some of the numbers. So this is just the percentage. This is using census microdata. We all filled out our censuses in a couple of weeks ago. This is the same data. We use these data to look at trends in labor markets. And this is the percentage of people by different degree types, bachelor's, master's, and PhDs, working in education, where that's defined to be, are you a teacher of some kind, and are you in an educational sector? The data that we have, the public use files, don't tell you, are you a professor or are you a teacher? You have to kind of ballpark it a little bit, but you can see that for men, for example, that of those who have a PhD, around 40% are working in the academic sector or as in education. One thing to remember, by the way, is that you don't have to be, if you look at the 10,000 PhD program project, results from U of T, you'll see a lot of U of T PhDs employed at the University of Toronto. They're not professors. There's been a significant increase in the employment of PhDs in academic administration in support of students in a variety of different, much more complicated organizations that we work in now. You can see for men, again, from 2006 to 2016, for PhDs under 40, which is just a way to get a sense of the young, newer PhDs, you can see a gentle decline of the fraction employed in academia. The same thing's true for women. If you look at the young PhDs, it's around 45 down to about 41%. So it's been a gentle decline there as the share employed in academia. But it's still, it's a question of half full or half empty. It's 40% of those in Canada with a PhD are employed in academia. That means the other, more than half, are employed outside of academia that we can measure. You can also see, just by way of just understanding the numbers, for those with a bachelor's degree, the fraction of women in education is much higher, more than double the number of men, and that's because they're more likely to be teachers and so on. Same thing with master's degrees. So that's what's going on in Canada in terms of the sort of academic job market. But the other thing to note is part of the rationale for investing in PhDs is you've got these very high skilled, very highly trained, specialized trained, educated, skilled workforce. And if they're not employed in academia, well, surely they can get a job outside of academia. And this graph shows you one measure of the degree of innovation happening in the economy. So this is the gross expenditures on research and development as a percentage of GDP. And you can see Canada, the bottom line there, the lowest line rather, relative, for example, to the United States, which is the highest level. And since 2012, rising fraction of GDP spent on research and development. And the OECD average, which obviously includes the United States as well, is basically flat. So Canada is remarkably low. It is, as an economy, one of the very lowest of any of the OECD for expenditures on R&D. So if one were to imagine that it's these kinds of, it's not just the R&D jobs themselves, it's really firms that have a culture of hiring PhDs, that might have be hiring PhDs working in innovation area. There's just a declining share of those firms in Canada. So your Googles, the big tech firms, they are not generally hiring in Canada. They're not generally located in Canada. They're in the United States. And so if you view them as hiring PhDs, which they do, they're not here. And there's not hardly any other offsetting firms. So this is really just a way to say the non-academic jobs for PhD students, if you were to look to this measure of innovation in the economy, it's nothing really to be optimistic about. Of course, PhDs can work in banks and everywhere else, so it may be that there's other employment opportunities that are unrelated to R&D, but this is still not very promising. So that's the basic labor market setup. So what we wanted to do was to say, okay, how do we answer this question that we were asked to do, which is to document what's happening to PhD students. And one of the first things I learned in graduate school was that, you know, the answer to the question, well, surely we must have data on this or that, is usually, no, actually we don't. That it's remarkably hard to get data on the things you actually want to answer questions about in social sciences. So the ideal data set, for example, for the question that we were asked to address would say, well, okay, well, what is the transition of PhDs to the labor market? How do we actually measure that? What you'd want to do is you'd want to have a longitudinal data set that tracks individuals. You know, you ask individuals over time, you know, to give them fill in a little survey. And so those data sets exist, right? There are lots of longitudinal data sets in labor economics, but they're not anywhere near big enough or focused enough on PhDs that we can answer the question of labor market status 1 year to the next. So this doesn't allow us then to have, we don't have the data that has, you know, what was your PhD in, where'd you go to school, what'd you study, how long did it take you to get your PhD, what was your academic background, what was your BA in before. There are very few data sets anywhere that have this. The NSF does a survey of graduates in the US where they do something close to this for STEM, for NSF supported disciplines. Then you'd want to know employment and job transitions, something we don't get even in the 10,000 PhD project, where you would imagine we know at a point in time that you have this job, we can observe it in your LinkedIn profile or whatever, but we don't know how you got there. So you have an academic job or a postdoc or whatever. We don't know how many people went from PhD to postdoc to postdocs and then went to an assistant professor job. That's just something which would be fascinating to know the answer to, particularly if we think about the nature of the PhD labor market. And, you know, maybe it's the case that postdocs are more important now than they used to be. It's very hard to actually answer that with any actual data. You'd also, in the ideal data set, need something about earnings. Obviously, you want to know whether people are making, you know, terrible income or not, or precarious levels of income or not. Another variable we might be interested in would be a look at job match. Are people actually happy in their job? Are they using the skills that they had developed in their PhD, or are they, you know, are they underemployed? There's all kinds of things related to job match we might want to know. Anyway, that's the ideal data set. We don't have it. So instead, in order to answer this question, we have to cobble together data from different sources and sort of shine the light in different directions to kind of tell us something. So the kind of data sets that people will use in Canada, one common data source, for example, that I use here, and I talk about here, is the public use microdata files of the Census of Canada. So the Census of Canada is done every 5 years. There's a labor force survey question there. You get to know somebody's earnings last year, their occupation, and so on. That's in the level of education, some demographic data. That's what we basically use here. There's a national survey of graduates, which is done every 5 years or so. And that is a survey of graduates 3 years out. And they ask them some questions that are kind of interesting, but not a lot of detail and not a very big sample of PhD students. Another data source, which is really cool, and I'm going to show you what these data look like, is our linked tax records. So increasingly, social science research is not done using household surveys or censuses, but rather using administrative data, where the government will link together through StatsCan and, you know, big secret, you know, concrete blocks of, you know, privacy and everything. So it's all protected, but essentially they will link tax records to other pieces of data. So universities every year submit, you know, lists of all their students and some academic information, and you can actually link these together. And so I'm going to show you some results from that. I'm going to see if I can. I'm going to have to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to share a different screen. There's probably some fancy way to do this. I don't happen to know what it is. I just have to figure out, there's Safari. There we go. I'm going to share this, and now you're seeing me on Zoom screen, but I'm going to show you this dashboard. Can you see that dashboard? So this is the post-secondary graduate earnings. So this is essentially a little, research lab in Ottawa, based in Ottawa. Some people I know at the University of Ottawa, Ross Finney involved. There's a few people involved that were started doing this, but now the government's putting this together where you can actually now track earnings of different, so you can play around with this. You can, it's interactive, and you can track earnings of graduates of different types of programs. And I've just picked out here master's, doctoral, or professional degrees. And this happens to be all fields of study. And there's females here, and you can see this is using their tax records, and you can see 1 year since graduation, what their earnings are, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. This is for the cohort that graduated in 2010. So you can then see exactly what earnings are. And then of course, if you want to say, well, how does that, what about humanities graduates? And I'll take out all fields, right? You can see they're not professional degrees, but you can see their earnings. If I go to business, you can see again, returns. If I go to PhD, let me go back to all fields of study here. The key point I would think in all fields of study, and this is you're gonna see this again, is that the PhD barely comes out ahead of a master's degree for all fields. Professional degrees, that's a good thing to do if you want to make money. That's the way to go. But the returns of PhD are this is again, pooling everybody, are pretty flat, pretty low returns. And these are constant dollars. So the fact that it's a slight upward slope means the actual real earnings are growing over time. But these data allow you to get a picture of the dynamics of what's really happening and tracking individuals or groups of individuals over time. But they have their own limits. I'm going to stop sharing this and go back to the other, back to the PowerPoint. And back here. So the linked tax records are great, but they're missing, you don't know really a lot about labor force information, how much people are working or not. It mushes together. It just looks at earnings, your taxable income. It doesn't really look at how many hours you work. Did you work part-time, full-time, all that kind of stuff. So it only tells part of the story. Plus, it's 2010. We want to know more than that. So this is just the graph, comparable graphs from the report that used the tax records to talk about PhD earnings. And you this is just to show you it varies by discipline, right? So that, business, it turns out business degrees are the way to go. If all you cared about was money, that's the way to go. And engineering is also pretty good and so on. So you can get a sense here. I'm not going to go into details. But that's just the earnings trajectories of PhD. I kind of find this to be somewhat interesting, but not super interesting. It doesn't tell you much except that there's different trajectories. So just keeping an eye on the time here to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. Just to show you what we do with the census instead. The census, essentially what we're able to do is this is the average earnings for men and women, total population. This is between fully employed workers, and then also younger PhD graduates. Those are people under 40. That's how we define it. The ages are all grouped in big groups. You can't only cut it so fine. The main thing I would point out, and I'm going to focus on the newer PhDs. Whoops. Is you can see for men in 2006, a PhD, male PhD, earned about $90,000. Not a bad outcome. These are all adjusted for inflation. By 2016, those earnings have declined, the average earnings. So the average earnings of PhD graduates are declining. Master's graduates for men, you can also see they are also declining, but not as much. And that's just an interesting result that real earnings are declining for newer. You can see up here for the full population, that's not true, right? That is less true. The story for women is different. For women, the master's earnings are rising gently, but for female PhDs, earnings are rising not continuously, but they went from 70,000 to 76,000. That's quite a bit of an increase. So we'll see that throughout. The common theme is that men get paid more than women as PhDs, but that can reflect their disciplines as much as anything. But secondly, that women's earnings are rising much faster than men's in the labor market in terms of particular PhD students, graduates, and college students. So one of the questions though is looking at the numbers, the fact, if let's say a PhD earns more than a master's student, that doesn't tell you that it's a good idea to get a PhD, because of course a PhD takes a long time to get. There's also other costs, but I'm just going to really focus on the time cost of a PhD. Certainly as a Vice Dean graduate, one of the big questions that we had was time to completion, and the fact that it was rising over time. And we often think about it's just the kind of a waste of a year at the margin for somebody just sort of floundering, or we think it's a great idea for them to spend another year. But in some sense, you want to think of it from the bigger picture and say, a student spending 8 years doing a PhD is really giving up 8 years of income that they could have had, 8 years of their life that they could have had with just a master's degree and sort of got on with it. That's a lot of money. And so one question then we want to look at is, if you just purely look at this as an investment in human capital, which ignores all the other wonderful reasons you study a PhD, we wanted to know, what is the actual rate of return? How does it look? And so what we try to do is just say, you just want to think about the PhD earnings relative to what somebody would have earned if they'd stopped the master's degree and just let their earnings rise over time as they would have naturally. Again, this is a thought experiment, so we just take 5 years, which is of course delusional in terms of time to completion, but we just have to pick a number, so pick 5 years. And then we estimate the returns to experience as well as the returns to the degree. Then what you can do is you can just map it out and just simulate the trajectories of earnings, which is nothing more than fancy ways to do the averages. And that one of the things we then do is say, how long would it take if a PhD student starts out, not surprisingly, behind somebody who's a master's graduate who's had this 5-year head start in their careers? How long does it take them to catch up and then make it worth it? Just to show you what that would be like if we use the tax data, you can see on this graph, let's just take women as an example. So basically, you can see that 1 year out, a woman with a master's degree is making, just under, something $55,000, $60,000. And same as a PhD student, same starting salaries. But of course, the master's student got there sooner. So if we think about it as being 5 years to do the PhD, then really we want to be comparing the master's student 5 years out, which is going to be, in this case, she's going to be making, something closer to 70,000. And that's going to be compared to the PhD student making 50 or 60, right? So that's the relevant starting point. They're the same age, and then off they go to run the rest of their earnings. And of course, then the question will be, well, maybe the PhD is going to just, earnings are going to grow and they're going to, catch up and eventually pass the master's, maybe. And then for men, you can see similarly the same kind of calculations. So that's that's basically what we're trying to do. I'm going to skip table A1 and A2. They're appendix tables. They basically just show you how we get the numbers. So there's some transparency here. But one of the things, again, to remember is, just so you can see, this gets to the last slide. Percentage with a PhD, we're looking at about 1% of the labor market. And that's for the full population. If you look at just university graduates under 40, so we just restrict it to people who have a university degree, not just high schools, then you're around 2%. So we're not talking about like a huge part of the labor market here. But one of the things you can see if you come down to the bottom line, which is the years for a PhD to catch up to a master's holder, if there's a negative number, it means the PhD student started out ahead. If there's a positive number, then of course it just takes time to catch up. So for men, this is the full population. Let's ignore that. Let's look at new PhD students. We're kind of projecting here. What you would see is that the years to catch up used to take 8 years for the PhD student eventually to pass the master's graduate. So they start behind and they catch up. Then it went to 10 years, now it's 16. So they're slipping further and further behind. For women, you can see it's the reverse, right? That in 2006, for these new graduates, that they start out, takes 15 years to catch up, then 3, and now they started out ahead, way ahead. Actually, just pretty much a tie because that's statistically insignificant. But that's the basic story, right? The relative for men, the PhD is becoming a less and less good idea, and for women, it's an even better idea than it used to be. Graphically, just to show you what those numbers look like, you can see this is just showing you that years after PhD graduation, that if you take the first line, whatever color that is up there, you can see it took, somewhere like 6-7 years to catch up. Start behind, catch up. These are differences in logarithms, basically percentages. But eventually they far exceed, so it's worthwhile. And then, of course, in the 2011, the line's fallen down, and by 2016, you're down to, it takes 16 years to catch up, which is a long time. So again, it doesn't make it so that it's a terrible idea. It just means that, wow, if you start discounting and taking present values and stuff, it's, the benefits are way down the road. For women, you can see the pictures are quite different, right? There, it's a closer call financially to do a PhD, and in fact, it's getting better over time. You're starting out, but still relatively flat. So that's the basic story that we had in terms of just the underlying, the overall picture of what's happening to PhD graduates in Canada. The labor market outcomes are worsening. The advantages over the value of continuing beyond the master's it's less and less of a worthwhile investment purely from a financial perspective. But for women, probably because there's a lot more opportunities for women in universities now, that sector has been more robust than it has been for male PhD graduates. So the last little bit of time here before we take break is to give you a sense of as an economist, coming more to an academic question, is really to see, what are the kind of puzzles that we can take to another level. For us, and so this is work that I'm going to be doing with Boriana Milicheva, who's a student of mine, she's just about finished. And what we're doing is what we're going to be essentially doing is using comparable data from Canada, the US, using the US Census, using the US American Community, it's called the American Community Survey, to try to get at some of the underlying questions, to get richer data than the public use data, to get into the really detailed data that we can get through the research data centers of StatsCan. But the big puzzle to us is that it is incredibly rare these days in the world to see declining returns to education of any kind. This is one of my favorite graphs, comes from a paper from David Autor, published in Science in 2014, but the graphs look pretty much the same if you were to wind them up a little bit further. This is a graph that you can show high school students if they really want to know whether they should go to university or not. This is based in the US, but these results. But essentially what you can see here is the relative earnings by education level relative to high school from 1964 all the way to the present. And so, for example, bachelor's degree, you can see that, and this feeds into inequality, this is the whole point. You can see that in the 1960s, returns to schooling were rising, and it was a great idea to go to university, really getting better and better. But then it started to crash a little bit. In the early 1970s, returns to university degrees were falling to the point where there was a book called The Overeducated American, written by Richard Freeman, famous book, basically arguing that we're producing too many university graduates and there's no jobs. Well, as it turns out, that was a blip largely caused by the Vietnam War, where there was a lot of deferrals, a big increase in education, a lot of the other thing that was happening at the same time, a lot more women entering the labor market, getting post-secondary, huge shift of the level of education represented a big shift in supply. But it didn't take long from about 1980 pretty steadily to the present, where the returns to education keep rising. If you then go to greater than a bachelor's degree, which is professional plus PhD, master's, everything else, you can see the returns have just been skyrocketing. So is just telling you that the value of getting more and more education has been getting higher and higher over time. That's for men, and for women, you can see the numbers over here are comparable. But these numbers, this fanning out, is really what generates and drives a significant amount of income inequality growth over the last, decades. So that's essentially, that's the basic story in the US. In Canada, it's not quite as stark a picture, but similar. So when we think about rising inequality, we think about the top 1% and everything. You know what? It's driven more than anything by education. As much as we might like to think it's just some rich people, no, it's actually all of us getting education. We are getting a bigger piece of the pie. And the story, there's a wonderful book written by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz called The Race Between Education and Technology, which really gets at the question of like through, and that's an economic history book, goes right from the end of the 19th century to the present, the history of schools, whether it be, oh, wow, we've got kindergartens now. Now we've got, high school, big high school movements. Throughout history, throughout the 20th century, public education just kept increasing. The number of graduates kept increasing, keeping up with changes in technology, largely keeping returns to schooling. They're there's high returns to schooling, but they weren't getting out of control. But at some point, education, you can only increase education so much, and technology starts to increase more. And the skills, the skill bias, it's called skill bias technological change, the demand for high skills just kept going and going and going, and we're not keeping up. And so that's what drives the return to education. That's the basic story. So what we're trying to do is to see why is it then that we're observing, that basic story is a supply and demand story. The demand curves for skilled labor is increasing faster than the supply. Here we have in Canada, the supply of PhD students increasing faster than the demand. And so the prices are falling and everything else. And that's really, what we want to be able to assess. That's just a story I'm telling. Is there a way that we can actually get down and really see that there's some truth to that? That's essentially the project. So what is it that we're going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at, once the pandemic is over and we can get access to the RDC data, how do PhD outcomes compare in Canada and the US? We have some early results on that I'll show you. To what extent do differences in demand? Is there something about the Canadian economy that is really kind of dooms our students, that in the US jobs exist for PhD students as a plan B that don't exist in Canada? I call it a plan B. That's a cultural question we can address as well. To what extent has public policy shifted the supply of PhDs? Are we really pumping too much money in and subsidizing students to do PhDs that shouldn't be doing PhDs? How important is international mobility to the story? Is it the case, we can actually look at Canadians in the US. One of the questions that we addressed to the panel right from the beginning was, is it the case that we care about PhD graduates of the University of Toronto and Canadian universities, or do I mostly just care about Canadians? What if a Canadian gets a PhD, whether in Canada or goes to Harvard, and then gets a job in the US? Is that a problem? Why is it a problem? Why would it be a problem? Maybe I only care that we allow our kids to go and excel on a global scale. I don't know. It's just a question that we can think about. We also have lots of students who weren't PhD students here. There's PhD students elsewhere. They come in and they take jobs. They are professors here. They're outstanding. They're contributing to the Canadian economy in all kinds of ways. Why is this? This is not a problem. So why do we do this? In isolation of looking just at our own PhDs. So it's really just looking at that question. And there's debate in the US about the role of international students and PhDs who crowd out and everything else. You can look at that. And the other thing is really to dig deeper on discipline, that how much does it really matter? It almost certainly does. But is it, we think about the supply and demand story, how much variation is there across disciplines? And what questions does that raise? So that's really where we're going to. And just to give you a taste of some of the quick results that we've got to this point, the first thing you note, this is comparing Canada and the US. This is just a graph over time of the share in academic jobs in Canada versus the US. And what you can see is the top line is PhD, is that the share of PhDs in academia is much higher in Canada than it is in the US. There's a lot more PhDs in the US employed outside of academia. There's, not surprisingly, more non-academic opportunities there than there is here. And that helps keep their PhD potentially keeps their returns of PhD higher. This is earnings by sector. And so you can see, again, Canada versus the US. What you'll see here is the premium to being in the US, non-academic jobs pay more than academic jobs. Not academic jobs in the US can include teaching at, a lot more of these, getting, junior colleges and so on. So there's not all teaching at Harvard. The Canadian market's not quite as extensive in that dimension. But essentially what you can see happening here is that there's less of a premium for non-academic. And finally, as well, that the salaries are just lower in Canada. Actually, the academic salaries may be a little bit higher. And the last slide I have before we get to conclusions, then I'll take any questions anybody has, is really just the return to a doctoral degree in Canada versus the US. And rather than comparing to a master's degree, I'm comparing here to a bachelor's, simply because the master's degree in the US is a little bit different than here. So what you can see here is just unambiguously the US lines are higher than the Canadian lines, that the value in the labor market of getting a PhD in the US compared to just a bachelor's degree is significantly higher and is rising over time. In Canada, it's flat for men, as I showed you earlier, and rising a bit more for women, but nothing like it is in the US. So that's just some early results that kind of show that, whatever we're talking about Canada is still unique. It's not the story that applies in the US in terms of returns to PhD. So that's really just the labor market stuff. What I just wanted to do in terms of conclusion, I'm not going to rehash the numbers. I just wanted to really sort of pose the question that we can discuss. Does any of this really matter? When we come back to our, jobs as professors and supervisors and, university administrators, how important are these labor market outcomes? Is that what the PhD is really all about? So does any of this matter for university graduate programs? How much does the labor market matter? How much do these findings matter? How much should it matter for PhD students when they decide to do PhDs or what to study? And then the other question is to come back and go, really, who cares? I'm not saying that. I'm just putting it out there. Like, we're talking about 1% of the population. And so what if their earnings are low? They're doing a PhD. So maybe they had a wonderful time and they're having these great jobs. And so is it really a problem? I don't really know. That's why we didn't address the question of too many, too few. It's a provocative question. There's ways to be more provocative than that about it. But it really is a question, I think, that gets at the heart of some of the policy questions that may emerge. The discussion is that, we care about this in our jobs, but is this something that society should say, we're pouring lots of money into PhDs. Oh, we're really worried about them. Anyway, I'll just stop there.